The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
It is finally Election Day. It is midterm Election Day 2014. I hope all of you have voted or will be voting in what's left of today. I voted weeks ago in Massachusetts via absentee, as I may have mentioned before. The big question is, of course, what is going to happen in the United States Senate? Nate Silver, polling guru Nate Silver, now puts it at about a 74% chance that Republicans will take over the Senate. He was on with George Stephanopoulos a couple of days ago, and here's what he had to say.
Look, it's still a close election. You have 6 or 7 or 8 races that could go either way, but like that poll in Iowa last night, which, as you mentioned, is one of the most reliable polls in the country. All these races are being held in purple or red states, too, so the bar isn't that high. So the polls are clearer now that the GOP will probably win the Senate. We give them about a 73, 74% chance right now.
You know, by this time in 2012, you had reached the point where you said it would take a systematic bias in all the polls. They would all have to be wrong for President Obama to lose. You're not quite there on Republican takeover of the Senate.
We're not quite there because you could carve out a path for Democrats that goes through actually some red states, like winning in Alaska and Georgia and Kansas. Those states, the polls are all close or ambiguous or both. But it looks like in the swing states like Colorado and Iowa, Democrats are underdogs.
74% is without question high. It is very likely that Republicans will take over the Senate. They need 6 net seats. However, 74%, Lewis, is not 80 or 85 or 90 or 95%. Stranger things have happened. And there is no reason at all for people not to vote today. And we'll talk later about this protest no vote concept, which I think is crazy. But aside from that, even if you think you can't make a difference because these polls are so overwhelming, they're really not. And people need to be voting. And 74%, we will see within 24 hours, really within less, probably within more like 10 or 12 hours, we will know what the verdict is, possibly some runoffs. But people need to be voting today.
Yes, it's not looking good, but try not to be discouraged, right?
At this point, do you tend, Lewis, to believe or to trust more in these meta polls and people like Sam Wong or Nate Silver? Or do you tend to look at individual polls and pick out which outlier you think is most accurate, as some people like to do?
I like to look at the meta polls. I think it's historically, haven't they been more accurate?
Yeah, we've seen time and time again, increasingly actually with recent elections, that the meta pollsters, and particularly the ones that we know to be accurate, seem to give us a much more both precise and accurate representation of what we are to expect in an election. Remember, in the 2012 election, Mitt Romney, presumably, at least reportedly, shocked by the fact that he didn't win, and it seemed that he had been relying in a way that didn't make any sense on those internal Republican pollsters, which seemed to be ignoring the realities of what Sam Wong and Nate Silver were saying at the time. As I mentioned, Republicans need 6 net seats today to take over control of the United States Senate. There are a few particular races that you should be paying attention to. Here are the ones I would draw your attention to. In Alaska, we have Republican Dan Sullivan up by 1 point over incumbent Democratic Senator Mark Begich. It really would be bad if we lost Begich. Having a senator like Begich in Alaska, although not a particularly progressive Democrat, still a good thing. And remember, I look at this not as a Democrat, because I'm not a Democrat, but rather as a progressive independent, and I'm just focused on who is the more progressive candidate here. In Colorado, surveys show Republican Cory Gardner leading Democratic Senator Mark Udall. Again, not a good situation there. However, it is still within reach, I guess, depending on what happens today. We're going to keep an eye on that one. In Georgia, Republican nominee David Perdue's remark that he was proud of his background outsourcing jobs did help the Democrat Michelle Nunn build a little lead in the polls, but that edge has basically disappeared. That one is too close to call right now. In Iowa, we see the race effectively tied. Democrat Bruce Braley is trying to mount a comeback against Joni Ernst. We'll talk about Joni Ernst a little more later. That is one out of control, crazy candidate. In Kansas, we have Kansas we're paying attention to. I'll just go through some of these quickly. Louisiana we're looking at. New Hampshire we have Scott Brown. Scott Brown, I really, really hope that he does not win there. The polls now have Brown leading by 0.9 points in the Real Clear Politics polling average. Lewis, I really don't want Scott Brown to again go to the Senate, this time in a different state.
No, that would be terrible. I'm really hoping that Mitch McConnell goes down. But David, I'm only a little bit optimistic here.
In North Carolina, we have Kay Hagan hoping to be able to stick it out there. In Arkansas, we have Senator Mark Pryor managing to keep his race against Tom Cotton pretty close. And of course, Kentucky, where Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell is probably going to win. There was hope that Allison Lundergan Grimes might be able to pull this out. It does not seem like it's going to happen. And Lewis, it really would have been just wonderful, even if Republicans were to take over control of the Senate, to see Mitch McConnell booted.
Yes, but after all, it is Kentucky. So what did we really expect to happen?
No, I know. The funny thing is, a lot of times when you get into the minutia, you're in the middle of the battle, you say, yeah, the Democrat really has a shot here. But then when you step back and you say, it is Kentucky, what is ultimately most likely to happen here? You kind of come back to earth. And optimism sometimes will cloud you, and you'll start thinking that these are going to be some potentially easy races. I guess it's still remotely possible that Grimes could take this over. Over the weekend, I met someone who just moved to Massachusetts from Kentucky. I was in Massachusetts over the weekend, said he had been working with the Grimes campaign and that they're just so unorganized. And I said, yeah, but everybody I know that works on a campaign says it's incredibly unorganized. I think these campaigns are by their very nature unorganized.
I think so, but it's still, it's important for the campaign to be optimistic, for the candidate to be optimistic, because if they aren't, I mean, how is that going to look in front of the voters?
Joni Ernst in Iowa seems to have come completely unhinged. She now kind of blew off Esquire magazine's Charlie Pierce when he pressed her on her criticism of how President Obama has been handling Ebola. And we've been talking about this. All of these right-wingers want to criticize President Obama for what he's been doing or not doing about Ebola. And when you want to ask exactly what President Obama should have done, the answers are far less clear. And we heard from Rand Paul that Obama's not taking seriously how incredibly contagious Ebola is, in spite of the fact that we still have almost no cases of it here in the United States. And we have here the clip of Joni Ernst answering but not really answering the question about Ebola. So here we have the audio, and Joni Ernst seems to be suggesting that it is an opinion. It is an opinion that only one person in this country has Ebola right now. Listen to this.
Defense Leon Panetti, he would have known it was a much greater threat. With Ebola, we see that he was very hands-off. He's not leading.
What should he have done about Ebola?
Leading.
What should he have done about Ebola?
Well,
There's one person in America has Ebola right now.
Well, okay, you're the press and you're giving me your opinion, but
so what opinion did Charlie Pierce give there? That he said, what should Obama have done about Ebola? Now, that's a question. That's not an opinion. And it's not even a biased question. It's just you're making a criticism about the president. What should he have done? And then saying only one person has Ebola. The only thing he stated, the only assertion he made is that only one person has Ebola. And it kind of sounds like Joni Ernst is saying it's your opinion that only one person has Ebola. Let's listen to a little bit more of this.
It's not an opinion. Only one person in America has it.
he is. But he is the leader. He is the leader of our nation. And what he can do is make sure that all of those agencies are coordinating together and make sure that he is sharing with the American people. He cares about them. He cares about their safety.
You don't think he does?
I don't know that he does. He hasn't demonstrated that.
You don't think he's demonstrated that he cares about the American people?
I'm done. So anybody else?
Listen to the allegation there that President Obama needs to be the leader, to quote how Joni Ernst said it. He hasn't been the leader, and he doesn't seem to care about people with Ebola. What planet is Joni Ernst living on? I guess she might have castrated one too many hogs growing up, and it skewed her sense.
It's funny. She says that Obama just hasn't been doing anything. Then later in the interview, she says that Obama did things that he shouldn't. Obama shouldn't be doing things, and the Senate should be doing these things. I guess, we've had 6 years of the primary GOP strategy was just Obama bashing. 6 years of this, and it's continuing.
Later, Ernst spokesman Alex Conant said that Ernst, when saying that Charlie Pierce was giving his opinion, meant that Charlie Pierce had already made up his mind about the election. What a absurd cop-out. I mean, it's just idiocy that we have going on. And Joni Ernst may win, ladies and gentlemen. If you vote in Iowa, please vote, because we may be electing, maybe even making Alan West seem like a reasonable guy here. This is just insanity. Let's talk about one race here in New York, where Congressman Michael Grimm is leading his Democratic challenger, former Councilman Dominic Recchia, 53 to 34, a 19-point lead, according to an NY1 Capital New York Siena College poll. Grimm leads among slightly voters in spite of the fact that, ladies and gentlemen, remember, he is facing a 20-count indictment on charges facing tax evasion and perjury. People don't seem to care, Lewis, that we may have a potentially future convict who is going to get elected.
Yep, this guy is a real piece of work. Hopefully he does not win, but I'm sure, I'm sure more skeletons will come out of the closet in due time.
And remember that this is the same guy who threatened to throw a reporter over a balcony, saying that he would break him in half. And he also, just so you know, participated in anti-bullying legislation. So I guess it doesn't matter that he threatened a guy bullying him to throw him over a balcony. Quite a piece of work, as you said, Lewis. And yet again, one of these circumstances where we seem to be separating ourselves from the reality of the people that we're voting for. A 19-point lead for this lunatic, Michael Grimm here, who is completely disconnected from reality, under a 20-count indictment, threatening reporters with physical violence, and he's going to cruise on to a win here.
People just don't know who they're voting for. It's really that simple.
All right. Lewis says people just don't know. Maybe people know and they think that these are the right people. I couldn't tell you. We have more election preview and coverage coming up. What would it be like if Lindsey Graham were president? What would it be like if Newt Gingrich were president? We'll talk about that and more next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show membership program is made possible in part by liberalbias.com. Liberalbias.com is your best source for unbiased news because conservatives know you reduce the abortion rate by keeping birth control away from women while teaching abstinence-only sex education. If that sounds unbiased to you, liberalbias.com is the website for you. Today's new member of the day is Matt Lenke. Matt, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. And remember that the 2015 Patriot Mail calendars are now available. You can get them at davidpakman.com/calendar15. And if you want a free calendar, people just loving this, also at davidpakman.com/calendar15, you can get a 1-year David Pakman Show membership with all member benefits, and we will give you the calendar for free. So check out davidpakman.com/calendar15. When you go to vote today, remember who destroyed the economy. You cannot forget the reality of this. 6 years after the financial crisis devastated this country, the economy still, understandably, correctly, is one of the primary issues that concerns American voters. However, in spite of the fact that the economy continues to improve, many voters and right-wing media and right-wing politicians seem to continue to blame the problems with the economy on President Obama and potential solutions on, or at least allege that the potential solutions lie in the policy of Republicans when the reality is far, far different. Remember that Republicans have been focused on, quote, fixing the economy in great part by cutting the debt and deficit, which we know is not going to fix the economy. You cannot possibly cut your way to an improved economy. On the other hand, while we've seen the supply side economics of the right debunked time and time again by economist after economist and year after year of data, we see that the demand side policies of the American Democratic Party, and the American Democratic Party is no great progressive bastion when it comes to fiscal policy, but it is certainly much better, much more progressive than that which we see on the right. We have seen unemployment decrease. We see record stock market, Dow Jones Industrial Average, NASDAQ, S&P 500. We see consumer confidence increasing. We see real estate prices starting to go back up, but at a rate that makes a lot more sense. And you cannot forget this, Lewis, when you go to vote today. Don't be bamboozled into thinking if only Obama had cut more, we would be in a much better economy right now.
Yeah, what would we do? Cut PBS? I'm not really sure. But yes, certainly Republican policies are not going to get us out of this. So we'll see what happens.
And we need to remember that the spending, if what you care about most is spending, right? If really you've decided what I care about for figuring out if someone's doing the right thing on the economy is, are we cutting spending? Remember that the federal total spending of $3.5 trillion in 2014 is 2.7% lower than what was spent in 2011. It is 0.4% lower than what was spent in 2009. The last time that we had a 5-year consecutive decline in federal spending was the period from 1947 to 1951. We have seen President Obama preside, in spite of the fact that this is not how you get to prosperity, in spite of the fact that Republicans won't admit it, President Obama has presided over a significant decrease in spending. People don't know it, Lewis.
No, and it could be argued that decrease in spending just isn't significant. But, you know, it's important because spending has just increased for so long. So I guess you could call it a stabilization, if anything.
For those of you who are not voting, either in protest, as a protest of the fact that the system is not a system that you find to be anything but a corrupt plutocratic system, and I would agree with you, by the way, if you are not voting because you simply don't think your vote would make a difference, remember that not voting is not a neutral act. Understand the fact that your protest non-vote, or your non-vote because you can't make a difference, actively is participation in helping the Republican Party, or in cases where you have two Democrats or two Republicans running against each other in primaries, it is supportive of the more conservative candidate. More conservative candidates tend to win when voter turnout is lower. And the idea that some have of, well, listen, I'm not going to vote. I don't care if I'm helping the right. Let them put in the craziest right-wing nuts they can find, because that will eventually push us back to Democrats and to progressives. Once people realize how crazy this is, you are also wrong there, because electing even if it's by sheer indifference, electing these right-wingers will allow them to further ingrain the status quo and make it even more difficult that we will have this drastic swing back to the left. So people need to not be confused about this. Not voting is a conscious action. It's a decision that helps the more conservative candidate. And this is why the right wants to suppress voting.
They do. Certainly there are areas where it will be very clear who's going to win, and perhaps your vote will make a difference. But in a lot of areas and in a lot of small elections, I mean, you're going to, you can at the very least try and stop a lot of gerrymandering that will be happening next election cycle.
And this is where Republicans are so good, because right after this midterm election is over, the Republicans are going to keep working on the school board, the city council, the state senators, the state representatives. And you need that base to then be able to push these people into higher elected office. The left, Lewis, is just not good at working on the off years. And by off years, I don't even mean midterms. I mean the odd numbered years where there are local elections. The day this is over, which, by the way, is tomorrow, the left needs to start organizing around the hyper-local elections, because where do you think the eventual candidates for bigger office come from? They come from these positions that Republicans are working on day in and day out.
Yeah, it seems like their efforts have been paying off. It's quite a movement, and we need to do better.
All right, if you want to get a little bit of a wake-up call as to what will happen if we continue electing Republicans, Lindsey Graham was caught on video. This is Republican South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham was caught on audio, on an audio recording, saying that if he were president, white men would do really great. they would do really, really great. Now, he was speaking to the Hibernian Society of Charleston, which is a charity organization. It is a mostly or exclusively a male group. So some are saying, oh, he was just joking around for the audience. But the funny thing is, what he said happens to be completely accurate. Here's Lindsey Graham.
I've tried to help you with your tax status. I'm sorry the government's so up. If I get to be president, white men who are in male-only clubs are going to do great in my presidency. We got any Presbyterians here? Yeah, good predestined to be here. We got any Baptists? They're the ones that drink and don't admit it. Methodists?
Yeah, he's a hilarious guy. Lewis, I don't think Lindsey Graham really needs to clarify that if he were president, it would be really good for white men.
No, I think everyone who knows anything about him would see that that's very obvious.
There's something about conservatism and humor that just really doesn't seem to work. And if you remember Fox News' attempt to challenge The Daily Show with Jon Stewart with a program called the Half-Hour News Hour, I dare you to sit through an entire show, if you can find archived shows on YouTube or wherever online. Something about satire and comedy and conservatism seems to be almost like trying to put two magnets together the way they shouldn't go. You just can't do it.
I think that would make for some interesting research. Let's find out exactly why that is.
Remember that most white men are actually not millionaires. So the fact that they would, that the rich white men that Lindsey Graham is actually catering to would do really well if he were president is completely separate from the fact that lots of white men who wouldn't do really well would still vote for someone like Lindsey Graham because they've been bamboozled in great part by groups like the Tea Party into thinking that that's how they vote their best interests. Newt Gingrich. What if Newt Gingrich were president of the United States? What's the first thing that he would do? He was on American Family Association, the Confirmed Hate Group's radio program. Brian Fisher was on vacation, so instead Gina Loudon was hosting. And she decided to ask the hard-hitting question to Newt Gingrich, if you were president, what's the first thing you would do? And here is the first thing that Newt Gingrich would do as president.
I think I would take a lesson from President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who on June the 6th, 1944, did a national radio address from the White House announcing the invasion at Normandy and closed by asking everyone to pray for the husbands and sons who were risking their lives landing to defeat Nazism. And then he said something very interesting. He said, people have asked me to declare a day of prayer, but the great war that we're in is so dangerous and so difficult that I believe every day should be a day of prayer. And so I am asking all of you to pray every day for the country and for the people, the Americans risking their lives to defend freedom. And this is, of course, a famous liberal Democrat who, the speech is well worth hearing. We used to get radio stations to play it on the 6th of June just because it was so shocking to people to hear a liberal Democrat this openly talking about prayer. I suspect the first thing I would do is say to the country, you're probably in as much shock as I am, and we should all go to God in prayer because we're going to need it to get America out of the problems it's currently in.
That's exactly right. Historian Newt Gingrich would call the nation to prayer. Basically, he's saying he would do nothing. His first action, he's elected president, or he's somehow president under some weird circumstances that aren't outlined by the scenario here, and he's going to call the entire country together, and he's going to say to do nothing, just simply to pray. For what? It's not clear. What if people are praying for completely opposite things? Whose prayer wins? Is it that one who prays harder? How do you determine that? I don't know, but that's what President Gingrich would do. That is a very scary proposition.
Maybe he only said that because he's on a program where the audience would like it. Maybe he's saying that because he's setting himself up for another run. Because I don't really think he believes that stuff.
Right. He probably would actually, the first thing he would do is cut social programs for poor people. That's what he really would do, but that's not the thing to throw out on American Family Association hate radio. You just want to appeal to God when you're on that channel.
Of course, you gotta plead the blood of Christ and whatever that means and all of that stuff.
Yeah, if someone can tell me what it means to plead the blood of Jesus, I would really love to know. And I try to do it every single weekend when I have a little free time, but I would bet, Lewis, that I'm not doing it right.
Maybe it just means having a glass of wine. I'm not sure.
Too bad I don't like wine, that, because then I'm definitely doing it wrong in that case. Follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/dpacman. What's going on with those Republican lawsuits against President Obama? It's so funny what's going on. I'll tell you next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
You'll remember that back in July, Republicans in the House of Representatives filed this historically unprecedented lawsuit against President Obama for delaying the Obamacare employer mandate. And the broader picture was President Obama is misusing executive orders to do whatever it is that he wants. Unfortunately, you may have noticed, unfortunately for Republicans, that several months have passed and we haven't really heard more about what's going on with John Boehner's lawsuit against President Obama. There's been some speculation that Boehner was just going forward slowly for fears that this might negatively affect today's midterm elections. It appears that if that's a part of it, it's only one part. It seems that they're having trouble getting lawyers to actually handle this lawsuit. This is so funny. Politico's Josh Gerstein and Maggie Haberman reported that Boehner's actually been having trouble finding a law firm that is willing to file the lawsuit. Two have tentatively signed on, and both seem to have gotten cold feet. Originally, it was attorney David Rivkin who crafted what we now know to be pretty unique legal arguments that Boehner used to justify the lawsuit. They were supposed to eventually file the lawsuit itself, but the firm, Baker Hostetler, pulled out. And then more recently, Bill Burke of the firm Quinn Emanuel also was tentatively hired for the lawsuit, but they're also backing away. Now, anybody with a with a good head on their shoulders and some legal common sense would realize that this is a very, very shaky lawsuit to begin with, okay? We see President Obama in general has actually used fewer executive orders than just about every president in recent history. He has not been overstepping his authority by using these. In fact, he's been pushed into using executive orders as necessary, for the most part because of Republican obstructionism. But it seems that some of these specific law firms just don't want to get involved in something so politically contentious because it could end up really backfiring on them. And Lewis, lawyers love lawsuits in the sense that they make a lot of money from suing people. And they're not even able to find lawyers that will sue President Obama. How ridiculous is this?
Yeah, there are probably some out there who at first glance would say, whoa, we have a chance to sue the president. This could be huge for us. This would give us a lot of attention. And then what I imagine happens here is they sit down with John Boehner or some of John Boehner's people and end up saying to themselves, well, what the hell are these idiots talking about? They've got nothing, and then it just fizzles.
It's actually not clear to me. I go back and forth about John Boehner having a relatively good head on his shoulders and being coerced into doing a lot of stuff from the most extreme right-wing sections of the Republican Party versus thinking that he comes up with a lot of these crazy ideas on his own. I don't know exactly where the lawsuit thing is on that. We know that with the shutdown, John Boehner was pretty upfront in saying this has to end. This is really not a good idea. Some facts for you. Has the House of Representatives ever sued the president before? Individual members of Congress and groups of members have filed lawsuits against the president and the executive branch, but neither the House nor Senate have ever institutionally sued the president for failing to enforce a law. And how have past lawsuits from members of Congress fared? Generally, they haven't done well. Usually, these the plaintiffs don't have standing, and courts can only step in to adjudicate specific cases where the plaintiff has received has been dealt some specific harm by the defendant. But typically, these go absolutely nowhere. We can assume somewhat safely, Lewis, that that's going to be the case here.
Yeah, this is going to go nowhere. It may linger until the president even leaves office, but nothing's going to happen.
Let's talk a little bit about Republican and right-wing claims that they are for small government. Now, if you've been paying attention to politics or this show for any amount of time, you of course know that the American right calls itself the party of small government. The libertarians, the conservatives, the constitutional Republicans, all these groups talk about small government to some varying degrees. Now, of course, there are tons of contradictions here. If you think about how there's small government, but they want to legislate the specifics of who can get married and what types of sex are legal in people's own bedrooms. Not really small government. If you think about they want to drug test individual welfare recipients, that's pretty invasive. That's not really small government. They are for small government, but they want to mandate the specific medical procedures that women seeking abortions must be subjected to. Tons and tons of these obvious double standards, and we're very familiar with these, Lewis. No surprise there.
Yeah, we can include voter ID on that list too, right? That's not small government.
That's right. We're supposed to just all be able to vote, yet we need very specific laws about when can voting places be open. And you need to get an ID that is kind of free, but not really, because the documents you need to get it cost somewhere between $8 and $45. Not really small government. Ebola may be completely toppling this facade of right-wing small government mentality, because look at what the reactions have been from Republicans around Ebola. Now, admittedly, much of this may be political posturing simply to say that the president is not doing enough and to suggest stuff that the president could be doing. But it's Republican after Republican that's suggesting the complete opposite of small government. Republican Chris Christie wanted the mandatory quarantines of individuals who have even been in that area of West Africa with regard to Ebola. Maine Republican Governor Paul LePage, who is now facing re-election, is trying to figure out how can we get the government more involved here, saying that he wants to use, quote, the full extent of his authority allowable by law to keep that nurse Casey Hickox in her house. And that's really not sitting well with a lot of civil libertarians who are not being bamboozled by the right wing's complete opposite stance to small government on this. Rand Paul, Mr. Libertarian, to many, the gold standard for libertarianism, told CNN's Candy Crowley that while the libertarian in him is horrified at the idea of indefinite detention or detaining anyone without a trial with regard to Ebola, at the same time, he's not saying the government doesn't have a role in trying to prevent contagion. Then you have people like Greta Van Susteren, who was just straight up confused. She's the Fox News host who tweeted that Casey Hickox is not a terrorist. She's a nurse. She wasn't thanked. She was treated like a criminal. And Greta blames President Obama. Of course, what President Obama had to do with Casey Hickox's mandatory detention in New Jersey, I have absolutely no idea. But are you seeing the same thing I am, Lewis, that this Ebola situation, for better or worse, is destroying any semblance of small government points of view from the right?
So it would seem. We know that, this also highlights how Republicans are basically governed by fear. So perhaps in some ways they do want smaller government.
And it's interesting, Lewis, what you're saying is interesting because you could apply the fear argument. This is actually really good to some of these other ones, right? Why do Republicans skip the small government thing when it comes to legislating who can get married and what types of sex are legal? Because of their fears about gay people recruiting others, recruiting your children, the immorality, God's wrath as a result of this. And there's a huge element of all of these exceptions to the rule of small government that do seem to be rooted in fear.
Yeah, when they're afraid of something, they will throw as much government money at it as they can to make sure that things go their way.
And as many men with guns, which are often kind of used to make people afraid of the government, they will all of a sudden be willing to use those men with guns to enforce the exceptions they've arbitrarily determined should exist to the general idea of limited government.
It's very poetic, I guess you could say, in some ways. It's crazy.
Talk to us about all of these stories and suggest other stories we should be covering. Go to our Reddit discussion forum. That's davidpakman.com/Reddit, REDDIT, and click the blue subscribe button, closing in on 1,000 Reddit subscribers. More and more conversation happening there. Check it out. Back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
A huge controversy has developed over actress Lena Dunham, and what some are saying is her admission that she sexually abused her own sister when she was a little kid. This started on the right, and I'll be perfectly honest with you, I don't really care where it started. I want to analyze the claims that are being made based on the facts that we have. However, it was Kevin Williamson, a columnist for the right-leaning National Review, who accused Lena Dunham of sexually abusing her sister in her new memoir, Not That Kind of Girl. And Williamson pointed to this passage where Dunham points to how she sexually experimented with her little sister, Grace. And here's what Kevin Williamson wrote. Dunham writes of casually masturbating while in bed next to her younger sister, of bribing her with, quote, 3 pieces of candy if I could kiss her on the lips for 5 seconds, anything a sexual predator might do to woo a small suburban girl, I was trying. At one point, when her sister is a toddler, Lena Dunham pries open her vagina. My curiosity got the best of me, she offers, as if that were an explanation. Then, right-winger Ben Shapiro published something called Lena Dunham Describes Sexually Abusing Her Little Sister. The author, Bradford Thomas, wrote, in one particularly unsettling passage, Dunham experimented with her 6-year younger sister's vagina. This was within the spectrum of things I did. In the collection of nonfiction personal accounts, Dunham describes using her little sister at times essentially as a sexual outlet, bribing her to kiss her for prolonged periods, and even masturbating while she is in the bed beside her. Now, Lena Dunham has responded to these allegations on Saturday, saying, the right-wing news story that I molested my little sister isn't just LOL, it's really effing upsetting and disgusting. And by the way, if you were a little kid and never looked at another little kid's vagina, well, congrats to you. Usually this is stuff I can ignore, but don't demean sufferers. Don't twist my words. Back the F up, bros. I told a story about being a weird 7-year-old. I bet you have some too, old men, that I'd rather not hear. And yes, this is a rage spiral. Then Lena Dunham's own sister tweeted a response to the controversy. This was yesterday. And she said, heteronormativity deems certain behaviors harmful and others normal. The state and media are always interested in maintaining that. As a queer person, I'm committed to people narrating their own experiences, determining for themselves what has and has not been harmful. Okay, listen. I don't care about the politics here whatsoever. Let's analyze this for what it is. The actions described by Lena Dunham in the memoir that she wrote, at first glance to me, certainly strike me as sexual abuse. Agree or disagree, Lewis?
I would agree, but consider that we're talking about like a 6-7-year-old kid here.
Right. So that's the next layer, which is it abuse if it's a kid doing this to another kid? And because of the world I'm in and the people I know here in New York City, I know, and because of my family, I know many, many psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers, etc. And when I've talked to them about the story, you're not talking about a pedophile here. You're not talking about an adult child sex abuser. That's true from a legal perspective. But you're still talking about behavior, which, if seen in a 7-year-old, the right thing to do would certainly be to treat that as sexual abuse and to get that child into therapy right away. So the excuse that I've seen that because it's a 7-year-old, the behavior is not really abusive is one that seems to be outside of the spectrum of the mental health community.
I mean, certainly the child in question here didn't know it was abuse and had no, it wasn't malicious. And
that's the next thing. Let's talk about that. The sister said, just because someone else has established that this is abuse doesn't mean that it is. If we take that statement and expand it broadly to victims of abuse, many victims of sex abuse who are victims while they are children will later in life say, you know what? I don't really think it was abuse. I don't see it as abuse today. And that doesn't mean that it wasn't traumatic or abusive. This isn't about telling other people what they should feel. But oftentimes, saying that something that happened wasn't really abuse or didn't really hurt them is part of a defense mechanism. And I'm really having a big problem with how this is just kind of being written off as it was kids and the sister doesn't think she was abused, so let's close this up. I think this is a pretty serious thing.
Well, we still have to take her word for it, the sister's word for it. If the sister...
that she doesn't feel that it was abuse.
Right.
And I don't deny that she doesn't feel that way, but we need to explore why it is that that's how she feels.
That's perfectly fair, yes.
All right. Let's talk very briefly here about gun stores being overstocked. What's the NRA going to do? Because gun dealers have overstocked. They're now selling off inventory that they have without really ordering that much from manufacturers. And this has caused the stock prices of companies like Smith & Wesson and Sturm Ruger to, is it Ruger or Ruger?
Ruger.
Sturm Ruger to see declining stock prices. And this, we saw after the Newtown shootings that gun purchases were higher than ever. Everybody was afraid. Tons of people were buying guns. We still are seeing, according to FBI background checks, more and more people wanting to buy guns. But it seems that we're not actually seeing the gun sales track the expectations from many gun retailers. So when I read this, Lewis, we know that fear is a primary driving factor in getting people to want guns and to buy guns. We know that the NRA is basically just a pro-business lobbying group whose goal it is for people to buy as many guns as possible from their clients, the gun manufacturers. What's the NRA going to do to bump up gun sales?
Good question. I don't know. Try and send more people onto television and radio to foment fear. We just haven't been seeing the media frenzy around guns lately with Obama's going to take your guns, the Democrats are going to do this, the Democrats are going to do that. So that's probably why sales have declined.
It's a pretty simple mathematical equation. If you want more guns to be sold, you can either, number one, increase the percentage of people who want guns, or number two, lower the bar in terms of what's required to get a gun. Ideally, you would do a combination of the two. Make way more people want guns and make it easier for more people to be able to legally buy guns. When you can't, and I would not suggest that the NRA would try to create a shooting. Some people are suggesting that. I'm not thinking along those lines. I'm thinking when there's a lull in gun sales because people may not be as afraid, the NRA would probably try to more aggressively lobby to ease restrictions and requirements for purchasing firearms.
Probably. That seems like a move they would take. If I were the gun manufacturers, I'd get into 3D printing and start making $50 guns available for mass production.
Let's go to your voicemails. We have a voicemail number. It is 219-2-DAVID-P. Listen to this.
Hi, I just wanted to call in and thank Lewis for saying how important it is that we record things that we see that are unjust. I think we're in a struggle right now to convince people to act, and I think videos and photos help people really understand. It's really easy to rationalize things and convince ourselves that maybe the black teen provoked the cop or whatever the situation might be. Photos and videos help people really understand that that's not what's happening. It kind of reminds me of the photography of Jacob Riis in the 1880s when he was able to use flash photography to highlight the conditions of the urban poor in New York.
Yeah, I agree. We do the videotaping of police activity has been a hugely eye-opening experience over the last 5 or so years. And without breaking laws, I encourage people to document what they think needs to be documented. No question about it. On today's bonus show, Lewis picks up a paintbrush. What did Lewis paint? Also, an interesting study shows that disgusting photos can reveal your political leanings. And Saudi Arabia's religious police have outlawed what they call tempting eyes. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. Go to davidpakman.com/membership. And if you want to get a membership with a free 2015 Hatriot Mail calendar, your coworkers will love this if you put it up in your office. Go to davidpakman.com/calendar15. Get the calendar, get the membership, and we'll talk to you on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.